Welcome back to another edition of KCOU Previews. I'm Billy Jones, joined as always by Ian Paprocki. Ian, how are things out in Wisconsin?
Things are good in Wisconsin, doing well. Having a fun summer, but looking forward to some fall football.
Yeah, I mean, who's not? And, one of the reasons I think people are very high on this Missouri team is not only the fact that they bring back the quarterback, but they bring back all the guys he threw to. When you're talking about the receiver position, the Tigers bring back all but just about 200 yards of their receiving from last year, and both of those were from the running back position. So when you look at the wide receivers and the tight ends, it's certainly a formidable group. Ian, is there any reason to believe this group won't take a step back?
I mean, I really think this is an exciting opportunity because you rarely ever see in college football an entire group of receivers and tight ends all return from a previous season. So yeah, I couldn't see a step back because of the amount of talent that's in this room. You have Luther Burden, who is one of the greatest college players in the country going into the season, a great wide receiver too in Theo Weiss. You have depth in guys like Marquise Johnson and Mekhi Miller, and you have a tight end who in Brett Norfleet, who I really think is someone who's going to break out in a big way this year. So I mean, this is one of the most exciting position groups to talk about.
Yeah, and I guess we'll start where we probably should at the top with Luther Burden, a guy that in 22 came in as a freshman and showed some flashes, but was really hampered by injury and an offense that kind of struggled to find itself in terms of its explosiveness. And the talk all offseason was, could he take that next step? Could he be the downfield threat that everyone wanted him to be? And he certainly was. That 86 catches last year, 1,200 plus yards, 9 touchdowns was phenomenal throughout the season. And, I wonder now that he's a projected top 10 pick, is there another leap that he could make in an aspect of his game, or do you think he kind of is where he is? And, even if they get the Luther that they got last year, it's going to be spectacular.
Yeah, I mean, I think if they get the Luther they got last year, they'd be happy because Luther last year was fantastic. But, I do think there is more in terms of the ceiling for Luther Burden, and just because of how talented he is at his age against this competition. I mean, his true sophomore season, he absolutely went off. I mean, he was one of the best receivers in the SEC, and it's the elusiveness and, the separation ability that he has. And, it's just so hard for players to take him down. And the ball's going to Luther Burden. We saw it in that Florida game. You and I called it, Billy, 4th and 17.
Yeah,
Who else is Brady Cook going to be looking to? Luther
right.
Burden. And Florida's defense knew that. And Luther Burden still got open down the field and made the catch because that's just who he is. He's one of the best in the game at doing what he does. And yeah, I think for a guy like him, there's always another level. And I think he knows that too.
Yeah, I mean, what the biggest jumps that I saw last year was I think his route running got a lot of better and his hands. He struggled some with contested catches his first year, struggled with holding out of the football. Part of that is just playing at a game with a new speed at the college level. I thought he really did a better job of that last year. I think also moving him inside helped a lot. Thought he was a lot more explosive from the slot position. I the one thing that I'm kind of held my breath on as far as Luther and saying, man, is if there's another level he can reach, what is it? I think it's his ability to consistently perform against elite cornerbacks. And listen, I understand part of the issue last year was there was definitely, some of his athleticism was hampered by you know, by that ankle injury. But the game I kind of specifically look back on is that Georgia game. He has the early touchdown in the first quarter, and then Georgia makes the adjustment to move Kamari Lassiter onto Luther Burden. And, listen, no shame in this. Kamari Lassiter is a guy that's going in the first round this year, but he was a guy that limited Luther for the rest of the game. And, Luther only had 2 more catches after that opening drive. And so I kind of sit there and wonder, what does he have to do to ensure that, when he goes against elite competition at the defensive back position, he's a guy that can be effective. We saw Denzel Burke also have a lot of success against Luther. Luther had, I believe, 4 catches in the Cotton Bowl. So, that to me is the next level that he can reach, is that in big games against elite cornerbacks, he's going to need to show out and make some big time plays.
Yeah, I agree with you about that. There is some concern, but really it's not a huge concern to me just because, that was his first real breakout season in this conference. And, you can't expect everything to be perfect. Look, he improved a lot of things. He improved the contested catch, like you mentioned, and that gives me confidence that he can then improve on some of these other things that you're talking about, like going up against some of the best secondaries in the SEC. I think that, there's just still another level and you can't expect everything to be absolutely perfect when a guy is just a true sophomore. I think there's going to be parts of the game that, are a cause for concern, but to me, it's really not a cause for concern because, he still has another full season of college football left, another full off season to make improvements.
I mean, I will say when you look around the conference, a lot of the guys that, were really effective last year have now moved on. Talking about, a Terry and Arnold, a Kool-Aid McKinstry, some of these guys that were, really locked down last year. Obviously, Kamari Lassiter's in that category too. You just don't have those dominant defensive backs like you did last year. So that's something to me that's going to be interesting to watch. Is I think this has potential to be one of the highest volume seasons in terms of passing, just because I don't know if there's the talent at the quarterback position that there has been in last year, in past years. Maxwell Harrison in Kentucky, maybe, is a guy, but I mean, when you look at the draft boards, there just aren't SEC guys at that position, ready to be drafted. So that to me is, creates an opening for a guy like, Luther and the rest of this receiving core to have a breakout season. And we saw that last year, obviously, with Theo Weiss and Mookie Cooper, who, filled in at the X and Z positions respectively. And, each kind of found their own little niche. We saw Theo Weiss be, dominant in contested, catch situations. And then of course Mookie just a great route runner. What do you expect from those guys? Now that they really are supreme veterans, what can they do with one more year of eligibility?
I expect them to take another step too. I think that they complement Luther very nicely. And I think it's very encouraging when, you look at the landscape of the SEC and all of these cornerbacks leaving in the secondaries, not necessarily getting better. And then you look at Missouri and these receivers, and they've still got each other and they've still got their quarterback and they've still got the majority of their offensive line that's one of the best, in all of college football. So that gives Brady Cook a lot more time in the pocket. It gives the receivers more time to work their magic and create separation down the field. And, I think Theo Weiss, like you said, a great contested catcher. Mookie Cooper, great route runner. Marquise Johnson became a really good deep threat, as that season went on. And just to have everybody back in a full season under that playbook and a full season, a full off season, I should say, to make improvements and to, try to adjust and create new strategies and, really, really for the coaching staff to utilize these weapons and have an opportunity to do that throughout a full off season. I think it's very encouraging. And I think, there's a lot to be excited about when you talk about those guys because Theo Weiss, that's a guy that can be a wide receiver one at a lot of schools.
Right.
Mookie Cooper and Marquise Johnson are getting a higher volume, I think, at other schools. But, they're at Mizzou and they're behind the best wide receiver in the country and Theo Weiss, who is likely the NFL draft pick next year. So, it's very encouraging to see.
Yeah, one of the guys you brought up, Marquise Johnson, I think one of the more interesting case studies, last year he had one job, and that was to run down the field and go catch the football. You look at one of the most astounding things is you always felt this way, but you go down and look at the actual averages. He averaged almost 30 yards a catch last year, 29 and a half, only caught 13 balls. But, you know, is is that his role on the team, or do you think there's a position for him to maybe augment his volume by finding a way to factor into the passing game in a way that's not just in a capacity as a deep threat? Does that help Missouri, or do they just simply not need that, and all they need him in for is, good for 1 or 2 plays a game where he can take the top off the defense? Like, do you think he needs to factor into the offense in a more more balanced way, or do you think this receiving room is so stacked that they just don't need that from him?
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily going to have to be his role in the long term, but for this upcoming year specifically, I mean, you have all these receivers coming back. It might end up being his role because he's just kind of behind all these guys, the Luther, the Theo, the Mookie Cooper. But a lot of receivers, a lot of these guys are going to leave after this year, and I think Marquise Johnson, will be looking to be ready to take that next step after this year. I know we're only kind of talking about this year and focused on right now, but Marquise Johnson, a guy who was just a true freshman last year. So he's still got some time to kind of evolve in this offense and create a new role for himself. And I think we'll start to kind of see that a little bit just because of his really good freshman season. But, I wouldn't expect it to be anything drastic in terms of, what he's doing in this offense, unless we see guys go down with injury. I think he's fully capable. I just think that this wide receiver room, like we said, is just so stacked that it's going to be hard for him to increase the volume too much in year two.
What I'd love to see is just him get better with his hands on short routes and, maybe have the opportunity a couple times a game for him to catch, some underneath stuff. Just, any opportunity he's got one-on-one on defender, just a little option route where maybe you can get him going towards the sideline with some speed, chance to do something after the catch. Because, I think the more you're getting the ball into his hands, the better it's going to be for you as a team. I think if he can get to the point where, he's catching the ball 2, 3 times a game, I think even that increase in volume could be deadly because anytime he gets the ball in his hands, he's dangerous. And there's also something to be said for the fact that, if defenses have to worry about him in the short passing game as well, that gives you more options as opposed to, anytime he's on the field now, teams are worried about him going deep. I think that just gives defenses more looks and something that, I'm sure when defensive coordinators have a full year to study the film of this Kirby Moore offense, like I think Marquise checking into the game is something that, they're going to immediately signal down to their defense to say, watch out, here he comes, watch for him deep. I think if you can open up that short game for him, that gives defensive coordinators a lot more to look at.
Yeah, I think so, but I think it also gives Kirby Moore a chance to play a little bit of chess because he also has the full off season to kind of make these adjustments and maybe
Yeah.
switch up his looks a little bit. So I think, that's another thing to consider. But yeah, I do agree with you about Marquise Johnson. I think his hands, yeah, they're good, but I think he can still make improvements. I think that the speed for him is definitely a weapon, but he still has a lot of growth to do. And I think it's, a very encouraging start with him only being a freshman. There's still plenty of time for him to do it. And, another thing you have to look at is like he's getting to learn from Luther Burden. He's getting to
Right.
learn from Theo. Not a lot of freshmen in college football get to kind of model their game and talk to these guys in practice and learn from such talented wide receivers who are, likely poised to go to the NFL after this season. So I think Marquise Johnson is kind of in a special spot, not only with that, but with, Kirby Moore and a full offseason to prepare because, we didn't know that Marquise Johnson was going to be the threat that he was coming into last season. I mean, he was what, a 3-star recruit, I believe, and
Yeah.
yeah, true freshman. It's not a lot that it's not very often that guys like that make such a big impact in their true freshman years, like Marquise Johnson did. But he burst onto the scene, and I'm excited to see what a full off season does for him.
Part of that, I think, too, was the injury to Mekhi Miller, in the middle of the season did kind of open up that opportunity. And listen, Mekhi is a guy that, we saw in that Florida game was fantastic down the stretch, just such a smooth route runner and a guy who's really quick and dangerous out of the slot. Obviously it's just again one of those things that when you're in a receiver room like this and you're as talented as Mekhi is, you're not going to get that many opportunities, even though I think he's a really, really good player. And hopefully if he can stay healthy, maybe get a few more opportunities this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you can look at some other guys, in that receiver room that are going to be looking for opportunities. Joshua Manning is one that comes to mind. Like, I'm very curious to see, how some of these guys who really haven't gotten their opportunity kind of fight for that because, we didn't see Marquise Johnson necessarily coming last year. Is there anybody in this room that's going to kind of have that similar impact that maybe we don't see coming at the beginning of the year?
Yeah, I think it might be if there is a guy, I think it's another freshman, James Madison the second. I think him and Courtney are both really talented players, but I think James is a guy that although he mostly played out of the slot, has a really, really, really good ability to catch deep balls and contested catches, and just has blazing speed, which to me I think fulfills a little bit more of a rotation spot on this team. I think part of that transition is if he wants to play more, I think he's going to have to move outside just because, the way Luther was able to work in the slot this year, and then obviously Mackay behind him is a guy who works primarily out of the slot. I think if he wants reps, he's going to have to move outside, although in high school he was primarily used in the slot. But I think he's a guy that can go in and change the game a little bit. Stands at 6'3", which makes him the tallest receiver on the roster. I think he's a guy that in the red zone maybe just gives you a different look, gives defenses something to think about. I think Courtney's going to be a great player. I just don't know if he factors in that much. And Daniel Budd and Josh Manning. I mean, you talked about it. Two guys that were highly touted out of high school, and I think Daniel had 2 catches last year, and I don't know if Josh even saw the field besides on special teams. So again, there's only so many opportunities to play when you have a room that's this deep.
Yeah, but I think it's encouraging when you have guys like James Madison and Courtney Crutchfield. I'm personally very big on Courtney Crutchfield. I think he's the future #1 wide receiver. But James Madison also, for all the reasons you mentioned, a very talented player as well. And I think it's not a bad thing if they don't see the field this year because, they're getting to be around, like I said, with Marquise Johnson and all these other guys. Everybody gets to be around Luther Burden and Theo Weiss, and they get to be with Kirby Moore, and they get to learn this offense. And it's an offense, it's an offense that really worked really well last year. And I think just being, in the room is a very big thing. And obviously those guys have the traits. I think Courtney Crutchfield, you already talked a lot about James Madison. I'll talk about Courtney Crutchfield. I think he's very elusive. I think he's a big presence down the field. I think his hands are very good. I think he's well-rounded. I think there's just, still some things in his game that he has to work on a little bit. But overall, I think it's very encouraging that, when you have guys like Luther Bird and Theo Weiss that are going to be leaving after this year, that you can feel pretty comfortable about what you have stepping in afterwards.
Yeah, that was what jumped off uh, in terms of the tape for me with Courtney, was what you're talking about with the hands and the route running ability. And I think you might be right that down the road he is the #1 guy. I just wonder. I think when you talk about guys that are going to have to factor in, it's not going to be consistent play. It's going to be getting in there 4 or 5 times a game. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to watch. I think the other uh, big part of last year that especially developed at the end of the year was the emergence of Brett Norfleet. It kind of been an issue with Drinkwitz since he had gotten to Mizzou, was the real lack of ability to find consistency at the tight end position. And I think Brett at the end of the season really emerged as a freshman, was behind Tyler Stevens, who is a fine blocking tight end, but really his hands just, let's be blunt, just really aren't all that good. And this is a guy that played his best football over the final 3 weeks of the season, including a 2 touchdown performance against Arkansas, had 2 catches against Tennessee, 3 catches against Florida. I think that he maybe is poised, um, when you talk about receivers and tight ends, to have the biggest jump from his freshman to sophomore year, especially with that frame. What do you think about that assessment?
I'm totally with you. I agree with you 100%. I'm very high on Brett Norfleet. And the thing about Brett Norfleet is he does not drop the football. He has some of the best hands that I've seen for a true freshman tight end in a long time in college football. And it's the athleticism as well. He's a very athletic, just athlete overall. I mean, he played baseball for a long time. Was going to play Mizzou baseball, decided to commit to just football. But we've seen the athleticism. His route running, but I think it's the hands that are most exciting. And he's already a very strong guy as a freshman, and I'm very excited to see kind of how he fills out because he's going to add strength this offseason, and I think that's going to really help his game and take his game to the next level, putting on a little bit extra muscle. When he's already a very strong guy who's already, very quick in the middle of the field.
I have no way to corroborate it, but there was a report coming out that he's put on 20 pounds of strength, so he's going to be even more of a force. And
It's
you know
scary.
how much we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but what do you think this does for Kirby Moore now, as he goes to sort of create his blueprint for what this offense is going to be like when you talk about these install sessions and, putting in the plays. What does it do for you when you have, a very capable and viable option at the tight end position?
What allows you to be more creative. I mean, Kirby Moore, and it's not just the tight end position. He knows his quarterback, he knows his receivers, and he knows Brett Norfleet because it's all guys that are returning from last year. So rather than try to play around and see what you have, Kirby Moore already knows what he has, and he's just getting the same guys who are going to a lot of them take the next step. A lot of them got stronger and quicker in the offseason. So I think it allows him to really be more creative in game planning and in drawing up plays during the offseason. And he doesn't have to worry about, can this guy do this? Can this guy do that? He already got a very good look at that last season because you're bringing back virtually the same offense.
Yeah, and we obviously saw that, that was his preferred personnel. There were times at the K-State game where they went, with just a running back and four wide receivers, but most of the season was spent in that 11 personnel. I'd imagine that's the same this year because, they want to be able to run the football, but you also got to remember that, your talent at the receiver position far outweighs your talent at the tight end position. And, I see very few times that, they put, Noel and Carroll on the field at the same time together or put two tight ends on the field either. I'd imagine we're going to see this team almost exclusively in 11 personnel or, maybe even scratch the tight end and just go four wideouts. Um, the Vandy games, the only one I can think of where there was a heavy use of 21 personnel. Hardly ever used 12 personnel last year. So, I'd imagine it's going to be relying on Brett Norfleet and Tyler Stevens maybe on rundowns to come in and spell him a little bit. We'll see though.
Yeah, I think the one thing that does concern me a little bit is the depth at tight end. Obviously, Brett Norfleet, I think, will take over the starting role as he already did towards the end of last season. But, Stevens, like you mentioned, good blocking tight end, but had some issues catching the ball. One game against LSU last year really stands out. I think that's kind of where, he started to lose his job at that point. It was like, okay, he can't catch the football, so we're gonna have to evaluate our options. But, if Norfleet were to go down, I don't know if I'm super confident in, everyone else in that position group in terms of just the tight ends. But obviously it helps when you have such a good receiver room and an offensive line in terms of, the fact that the offense will still likely be functioning okay. But, if there is one concern that I have, it's probably there with that depth in the tight end room.
Yeah, I mean Jordan Harris was a guy who had some opportunities to start specifically that Memphis game, but really just never provided much. Again,
He's got potential. He's got potential. It's the inexperience.
right. And I think you're right. The tight ends can be such a matchup nightmare um, in college football, especially because now kind of the base defensive package, has gone away from, four defensive backs. Almost every team in college football now plays with five defensive backs on every play. So, having the ability to have a tight end who can line up on a linebacker or safety and be a receiving threat, as well as provide some extra bulk in your run game is just so crucial.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you. And I know we're not talking about running backs, but another thing is just I'm interested to see, with that one position group being the one that's changing this season, does that affect the passing game at all? Because last year I think Cody Schrader was so dominant that, it almost opened up the passing game to me because you had a guy, who was able to rush for I think it was 200 yards and a half, close to 200 yards and a half in that Arkansas game. And then, in the second half of that game, the passing game kind of opened up a
Right.
little bit. So I'm kind of curious to see what the effect is there, but um, yeah, overall, it's going to be interesting.
Especially because, this is a scheme that's based heavily on running the football and then play action off that run game. It was part of the reason that, in 20 and 21, the Drinkwitz offense was very effective, and in 22 was pretty dormant for most of that season. And listen, I get it. It is Kirby Moore calling the plays, but it is a very similar scheme. When you look at the way they ran the football with the outside zone stuff, the personnel packages, the motion is all very reminiscent of the Drinkwitz kind of architecture. It's just Kirby Moore obviously calling the plays. But I think you're right that the run game is so crucial, and what I think should give Missouri fans a little bit of hope. We'll talk next time about what that running game we think will look like, but you return three out of your five starters on your offensive line. You got two really talented players out of the portal, and Drinkwitz has now produced two leading rushers in the SEC in his 4 years at Mizzou, and he had one in 20 with Larry Roundtree, who was in the top four. So, I think he's earned, maybe a little bit of patience and in that capacity, but we'll see. But again, this offense is certainly the most dangerous when the play action game's working, because that's when you can get some of these talented athletes in space down the field.
Yeah, I know we talked a lot about it last week, talking about Brady Cook, but it kind of starts with him and his confidence level. And I think, a big thing for these wide receivers will be how confident is their quarterback returning, and, what is his play like? And I think that, for this entire receiver group, them being familiar with their quarterback and having a whole off season under their belt after playing with their quarterback is something to be very excited about as well.
I kind of wanted to ask you one final question before we got out. So Mookie Cooper finishes with 447 yards. Marquise Johnson with 383. Mekhi Miller battled injuries. Didn't play a whole lot for a lot of the season. He finishes with 148. Who is Mizzou's third leading receiver this year? If we're assuming, we can even bring Brett Norfleet into that mix. If we're assuming that one is Luther and two is Theo, who do you think will be the third leading receiver at the end of this year?
You're bringing Brett Norfleet in the mix. I might go with him. I'm just
Big
super
threat.
high on the jump that he's going to take. I think Mookie Cooper and Marquise Johnson, both of those guys are still going to play a very big role. I really think any of those three between Norfleet, Mookie Cooper, and Marquise Johnson could end up as the three behind Luther and Theo Weiss. But if I'm putting my money on anybody, it's Brett Norfleet, just because of how encouraging his season was and how much he improved throughout his
Yeah,
freshman season in
that's
the
the big thing.
maturity. It was the maturity to kind of, make adjustments and get better throughout the season as a true freshman, that impressed me, along with just the pure intangibles that he has that are already super impressive. So I'll go with him.
It's got to be so big for a freshman to finish the season with the confidence he did and being able to take that into the offseason. It's got to just feel so good.
What about you? What do you got?
I think it's going to be Marquise Johnson. I think he takes a massive step forward this year. I understand he was not a very high volume catcher last year, but certainly had his moments. I think he's a weapon that I really don't think Mizzou knew fully what they had in him when he came in as a freshman, and was something that they just kind of put in a couple plays each week to give him a chance to go make something happen. I think this year he gets a lot more touches. I think a lot more is geared in his direction. I think he's going to have a really, really special season.
Yeah, I think it's all about that opportunity. He was able to get the opportunities last year, but they didn't come in a very high volume, just because he's, like we talked about a little bit earlier, he's behind these great wide receivers. So, I think it comes for him, it comes with, what's the opportunity going to be like? Brett Norfleet, I think, is pretty comfortably the tight end one going into the season, whereas, Marquise Johnson, we don't exactly know what his workload's going to look like. But if he does see an increase in snaps, like you're kind of saying, I do think he's going to take a very big step forward because of the raw talent that he has.
You got anything else to leave our viewers with before we head out?
Yeah, I don't think I've got anything really that we haven't covered, just that this is probably the most exciting position group. I know there's, plenty to talk about when, we get into some of the other position groups around this team, but um like I said earlier, it's very rare that you have such a talented group of receivers and tight ends in college football, and they all return the next year with the very same quarterback, coming off a 10-2 season. So I'm very encouraged by this group, and there's high expectations. There's going to be pressure, so I think they've got a lot to prove still.
Yeah, and I mean, you look around the conference. I think the only wide receiver group that you know, I can confidently say is better is that, I think Ole Miss's across the board might be a little bit better than this Missouri group. Again, I think Luther Burden is the best receiver in this conference. But when you're talking about Trey Harris, Jordan Watkins, and Caden Prieskorn as a tight end option, oh, by the way, Juice Wells joins the Rebels too. And then Texas with some of the transfers they brought in, and Amari Niblack and um, Isaiah Bond as well. I think you could also throw in there. But I think this group is as good as any, and I'm really excited to see what they can do this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I am as well.
All right, we'll see you guys next time for another KCOU preview. This has been Billy Jones and Ian Paprocki. Thank you for listening.